Welcome to episode 5 of Øredev Debrief Week, and it's time for my chat with Laura Herman. Laura had the 5th keynote of the conference, and it revolved around how AI has shaped and continues to shape the world of creation and curation. We talked right after her keynote, and we discussed different groups' perspectives on AI, what influences how people feel about it, sustainability, and also her own research into AI and creativity, as well as discussions about curation in various ways. It was a really interesting conversation, and as usual, links to the keynote and all the other things we talk about are, of course, in the show notes. Consider this chat a great appetizer if you haven't seen the keynote yet. Big thanks to Øredev for inviting Kodsnack again. They paid for the trip and the editing time of these keynote recordings, but they have no say about the content of the episodes. Thanks for listening. Enjoy. Welcome, Laura, to the slightly smaller stage.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and thank you for a great keynote about generative AI and so many of the question marks around it.
Many question marks, yes.
Yeah, you didn't even get outside of the room before the questions started.
It's okay, I'm used to it.
So have you done this type of presentation to developer crowds before?
It's a good question. I have, but it's been a while, so I think a lot has changed since then. I often get to talk to more creative audiences, so there tends to be a lot more fear and concern versus like the excitement about integrating it. And then I've also had the chance to talk to some different journalists who have a really interesting perspective. So that's been fun. They're particularly interested in the content credentials aspect of things to make sure they're clear about the provenance of the images and their text and all of that.
Of course. So I mean, I think it's really wonderful and interesting that you come a lot from the art and artist side of things.
Yes.
Because I've been curious myself, like, what are the reactions in those areas to all the generative things? And
well, it's a wide range. I will say there's some artists who are doing really, really amazing things with the technology and have been very early adopters. And there's a lot of conversation about generative art being a new art form, a new medium, kind of the next stage, the new frontier. But then there's also a lot of artists, particularly people in specific fields, that are very worried about their livelihoods, and rightfully so, right? There's a ton of concern, and there's very specific roles that are at risk of automation. So they bring that sort of fear to the generative AI conversation. And there's also a lot of conversation right now on the legal aspects of things, right? Copyright and how that influences creators' rights over their work, who owns the generative outputs and who's compensated for those. So at Adobe, we've taken the much more careful approach of we're only going to train on content that we have the rights to, that we have licensed, that we know our creators have been compensated, but not many others have done that. And so that's kind of somewhat of a technically risky decision for us, but more of like an ethically sound decision that we believe in.
I mean, that felt like such an important question to me from very early on. It's like, it could be that all the stuff people are generating at the moment could turn out to be more or less illegal or license encumbered or infringing. And I mean, so that's it's a good starting point. And one thing I've thought about when it comes to, I mean, of course, developers, primarily for my case, it feels like there are so many different mindsets. Some people have a mindset that sort of, they see the possibilities much quicker than grumpy myself on a Monday morning, for example.
Exactly. Yes. And even within a single person, like you say, like maybe when you're grumpy on a Monday morning, it's different from when you're like energized on a Thursday afternoon. So one of the things that my team is actually working on right now is trying to map out all of the different factors that seem to influence people's perception of and adoption of generative AI. And there's such a huge range, of course. It's almost an impossible task that we're setting out to do. But we have an overarching framework of things like, experiences with harm and bias that influences people's perception. Another thing that influences people's perception is their tech literacy and their age and their generation. Something else is like their cultural context, right? It's a very different conversation happening here in Europe than is happening in the States, which is very different than what's happening in India and so forth. So there's so many different factors at play to even within a single person. As you were saying.
I noticed myself that I have very different feelings about different, I don't know what the correct term is, different types of generative content. For example, I noticed myself being much more negative to text
for some reason that I can't quite place. But generating images, I get this feeling of a dialogue where I can sort of put in, a vague dream sequence and get a vague dream image out of it, and that's sort of triggers that one-armed bandit playful kind of thing. It's like, oh, let's try one more, let's adjust a little bit and see what comes out. And so that definitely puts me in a sort of creative mode that I wouldn't have had otherwise.
What is your sort of professional background, if I can ask?
I mean, I'm mainly a front-end developer.
Okay.
I write code.
Okay.
That's my professional.
Because one of the things that we've seen, which it's very early days, so this may or may not stick, but people are very excited about generative AI when it's doing things that they don't have as much skill to do themselves, whereas they're much more hesitant about generative AI when it's doing things that they have the skills to do. Now, it seems obvious, but something, for example, of like when you talk to authors, they feel similar to you about text of like, no, but they're so excited about the images potential because they're like, oh, I can illustrate my whole novel. Whereas when you talk to photographers, it's like the inverse of like, oh, I don't want to deal with my typing out all these contracts for my clients, and I don't want to deal with client communication. So the text is awesome, but I don't want it making images because that's my bread and butter. And so it's this really interesting, like it kind of maps very neatly onto people's skill sets.
And I also noticed in myself again, and I think in people I talk to as well, that this ties in, I guess, with the importance of the content authenticity and stuff like that. That the generative work makes me appreciate the completely human-generated work in a whole different way. Like, I mean, I draw our stickers, and
I love them.
Somehow I feel even better about drawing stuff myself when. Because this is super personal. This is just me there, and that's definitely a positive outcome as well. I appreciate the works of others more as well because a human put in all
a human touched this.
Exactly.
Yes, there's something that is in the academic literature actually that they call the handmade effect, and it's been around for decades, right? Like there's this sort of obsession with like handmade things. I mean, Etsy as a platform exists specifically to serve like handmade, like audiences that are obsessed with the handmade, which is a huge portion of the population. It's considered the sort of a luxury item if something's handmade. And I think that we just see the handmade effect getting like stronger and stronger now because of generative AI. Of like, not only is stuff being made by humans operating machines, but it's being made by machines operating on their own, then there's this even more of this like kind of craving for that human touch, for sure.
I mean, of course, it's so true that, as you say, that it's been around forever. Like, I mean, think of like handmade luxury goods and stuff like that. We definitely appreciated that.
Yes, absolutely.
I thought it was interesting to get some thoughts about, AI as curation as well, and how the algorithms affect us. I mean, in a way, I guess the generative aspect is sort of a curation as well. It's like I write something, let's see what it filters out of sort of the average of all the inputs in the world. And I guess that's also something that must be pretty different between artistic people using generative models. Because you were showing this, the different stages of work, how it might look with and without generative AI. And I suppose it must be very different between individuals where in the process they want to put in something generative. Because I feel when I code, I'm 50-50 if I want the suggestions or not.
Exactly.
Sometimes like, yes, please fill it in for me so I have something to work from. Skip the blank page. And sometimes it's, no, don't disturb me. I just want to write this part myself.
Just let me do my thing.
Exactly,
for sure.
Exactly.
Well, I think that's what's going to be so important is the ability to personalize and have control over what that experience is. So something that we're always saying over and over to like the teams that we work with at Adobe is like, just give the user the choice. Like, and it's not that they need to choose from scratch, right? There can be a default option, but make sure that we're always giving them the choice. So we're not forcing them into certain behaviors, particularly in the realm of generative AI, where there's so much emotional valence as well. Yeah, definitely.
I really liked, back to the authenticity parts and the systems Adobe is building and others. I really like the interface where you could see these are the constituting images for this final product.
little family tree.
yeah, exactly. I really want to see that in the generative models as well at some stage.
Yes, that would be so interesting, wouldn't it? I wonder if that's even possible to expose. But something you were mentioning, artists, and curators in their process. Some of the sort of bleeding edge artists, for instance, there's an artist named Jake Elwes who's been playing with AI for a long time. They're coming up with their own data sets, and they're doing that like pre-curation. So they curate a data set, and then they use that to train the model, and then they curate the outputs of that model. Well, first they direct that model, and then they curate the outputs of that model. So there's like multiple phases of curation. I think that data set curation, I was talking with someone in the audience actually about how we're moving towards these more smaller and smaller, like specialized models. And so the data set curation aspect for those is going to be even more important, because basically what we've been doing until this point is like, just throw in everything but the kitchen sink. And then hope that it produces some semblance of reality. But what happens if we need to be very picky about what we're putting into the training data set? How do we choose those images or videos or media files? So that's what I'm really curious to see how that evolves, and like what is the role responsible for that, and like who determines. We have a content curation team at Adobe, but they've existed for I think over a decade because we have Adobe Stock. So they've been thinking about stock imagery, which is kind of the flip side of generative. But I think most companies don't have a curation team on hand. So what does that look like in practice? I'm really curious to see how that plays out.
But that's a thought that can really excite me as well, when you can. I mean, if you can let me build a model based on my own photos, my own creations, and my own text, and then it suddenly becomes much more interesting to see. What can you filter out of my own writings?
I'm really like Notebook LM has that. It's interesting. We have created custom models for specific brands. So right now, Adobe's models don't create anything that would be like commercially. Like infringing on copyright, right? So if you're Nickelodeon and you type in SpongeBob, you get a very strange result from Firefly. It's like a little sponge and like a man who looks like his name is Bob, and like it's not correct. But we can build a custom model for them based on their internal assets that they don't want to be shared. So it's kind of in this garden wall setting. Trained on only their assets, specialized for them and their brand guidelines and all of that, so that they can type in and get personalized outputs. So we've been doing that specifically with brands, but I am very curious about like if it's possible or what it would look like to do that on the individual level. Of course, that then comes with a lot of potential for harm and risks in terms of copying people's specific artistic styles. So there's some interesting tensions. Always with the exciting, positive technology advances, there's the risks and the negatives. So
of course.
Balance those.
Of course. But it sounds really like it could be an entertaining afternoon to use one of the models that brand restricted. Put in lots of brand stuff and see it work around it.
Exactly.
Sounds like a fun afternoon.
You'll see. It's try any brand kind of thing, and it's creating very strange, like Coca-Cola or whatever. It'll be like not at all what you expect.
A quick but huge thank you to everyone sponsoring us on Coffee. You too can become one of them by surfing to ko-fi.com/KODSNACK Kodsnack, and giving us either a one-time donation or monthly support. If you support us on the coffee drinker level of €5 per month or more, you get a bunch of very nice stickers in your actual physical mailbox. And if you support us on the barista level for €10 per month or more, you also get a thank you right here. Big thanks to Albin Groen, Svante Richter, Anders Legell, Brother Ingo, and Tobbe Lundberg. Everyone who supports us helps make the podcast possible, and the more of you there are, the better we can make the podcast. We do sometimes have sponsors, but it's actually your support which is making it possible to cover our monthly costs. And if you want to support us in other ways, you can of course give the podcast a review in your podcast player. That also helps a lot. Give it a thumbs up, a star, write a comment, or whatever your player supports. Or of course, simply tell someone who might like the podcast about an episode. And remember, you're a fantastic person whether you support us or not.
So another thing I'm curious about, because you really meant it was pretty much just part of a slide at the end there with working and thinking about sustainability.
Yes.
How is that process working? Or because that sounds like a really tricky and essential problem.
Yes, it's a huge undertaking. I would say that being in a business, I would encourage everyone listening to this, if you're working in a business, there is such a strong argument for sustainability because the same things that are going to make the training process and the generative AI process more sustainable are the same things that are going to drive down your costs as a business.
Yeah.
So we've gotten some really great buy-in internally, even from our most senior business executives, because they're like, oh yeah, let's do these ways of reducing climate impact, because we know that it's also going to have this added positive effect. Yeah. So it's actually been, I guess, in a way, we've gotten more quick buy-in than we expected, which is always a pleasant surprise. But in the Inclusive AI Lab, which I was mentioning at the end, we have a focus on sustainability more from the perspective of the Global South. So there's a lot that we can learn from people who are in the Global South who have been experiencing the sort of climate crisis much more firsthand for many more years than most of us in the Global North. They've already been dealing with it, and they've already been grappling with the consequences. So there's a lot that we can learn from them. But it's also important to consider that they're the ones feeling the first effects of a lot of the technical choices that we're making here. So we need to be very cognizant of how we can support them and rectify as much as we can some of those decisions. So are there resources and research out there that I could find and to figure out what people are doing when it comes to sustainability? Because it seems like what's floating by in my feed is mostly people complaining about the fact that resources are used. Yes.
And it's easy to, go along with that and feel like, yeah, this is horrible, but I assume people are doing stuff, but I'm not finding it, so I would like to.
Yes, definitely. I mean, one of the things, just very basic, is what I mentioned earlier about moving towards smaller models. Yeah. Because those take a lot less training resources, and even when you're calling those models, it's much more sustainable. So even just like having an overarching practice of moving towards those is a good practice. But then there's a lot of sort of hardware considerations too, like getting into the weeds of like, okay, which particular sort of like GPUs are we using and how many, and how can we minimize that so that then we're not having as much sort of like carbon output. So I feel like there's more, and actually we should probably create I'm imagining in my mind a framework for like different approaches to sustainability and AI, because there's a very like use case, user facing, like what is the core of this application versus the more like back end of like, okay, how do we need to change the hardware accordingly? And all of those are important, and there's also a lot in between. So maybe I will get to work on that and report back to you.
I'm looking forward to it. And I suppose that's also one of those classic cases of the large, famous models and big companies stealing all the spotlight.
Yes.
And they have a huge model, so they use a huge amount of resources for that. And then the mind starts associating that with the whole concept. And like you say, that just the concept of AI is, it's so wide.
It's so broad.
And it's being labeled on everything right now.
I mean, it's like, okay, I did a statistical regression. It's AI. It's like,
exactly.
Maybe not.
so I'm like you mentioned, I'm looking forward to when people start using slightly more specific terms again.
Exactly.
Because that will make it much easier to figure out.
To actually be able to communicate with each other.
Exactly.
Yes, 1,000%.
Just going in and shouting, computers!
Exactly.
Technology.
Thank you. Yes. 100%.
So, I got lost in my notes. It's a classic.
I love the visual layout too. It's nice.
Yeah, I mean, it works well for getting stuff down. It's a bit slow to sort through sometimes.
The curation again.
But I would love to know a little bit more of the research you've done as well.
Yes. So it's interesting. My PhD was, when I started it, I said, okay, I'm going to think about, first I said I'm going to think about how emerging technologies are influencing creativity. And at the time, I was really into virtual reality and augmented reality. And I'd been working on that in the industry for a while. And so I thought that's what I was going to do. Then I started to hear more and more about AI, and I was like, what is this like? What is the there? Is that actually going to influence creatives in some way? I'm not sure. But let me look into it. So I started my PhD focused on AI and creativity. And everyone in my department, in my family, my friends, everyone's like, AI and creativity, like the one thing AI can't do is be creative. Like that is the definition. Creativity is human by nature. Like you're wasting your time, like choose another topic. And I was like, and luckily I was doing the PhD because I was genuinely interested in it. And so I was like, I'm going to follow my sort of like nerdy heart and go for it.
That's what research is for.
Yes.
This is a big question mark.
Yes. And I was, why do a PhD in academia versus being in industry was because I could investigate these questions that I truly cared about. There had no ties to sort of profit making, whatever. So I started researching AI and creativity, and that's when I decided to focus on algorithmic recommendation systems, because that was a really like proliferate sort of form of AI at the time. And then by the end of my PhD, it was like all anyone and their mother was talking about was AI and creativity.
Oh,
I was like,
because you started well before the generative AI.
I started before the generative AI boom, and then I finished during the generative AI boom. So it was, I guess, good from a career perspective, but kind of hilarious from a personal perspective. Of like, no one cared, no one was giving me funding, like when I started out. And then by the end, it's like there's been so much interest.
Most obvious thing.
Yeah, exactly. And yes, everyone has an opinion about it, right? Which is both nice and also frustrating sometimes. But
of course.
But I was looking at, okay, how are these algorithmic recommendation systems influencing the creative ecosystem? And because, as always happens with a PhD, you come in, you have this huge big idea, and then your advisors are like, that's 5 PhDs. We need to like scope this down. So I specifically focused on creative professionals' experience of algorithmic recommendation systems, and that was a bit of what I was talking about in terms of artists changing their practices because of tools like Instagram or TikTok. Which I think is now like quite straightforward for a lot of people, but at the time, and even now today in the quote-unquote art world, there's a sense of like, no, artists are creating for art's sake, and they are like, and you know, maybe they're influenced by the art market, but they're certainly not. Instagram isn't changing that. But the reality is that these artists like are trying to make a living, and right now that's where they're getting gallery representation, that's where they're getting collectors and all of that. So it was really interesting to sort of see how they were grappling with it, because many of them were like, they're sort of like in this emotional turmoil similar to what we're seeing now, where they're like, I know I shouldn't be influenced by this technology, but the reality is I need to make money to put food on the table, so I'm going to do what I need to do. Whereas other people are avoiding it entirely, and you start to see the early adopters thing play out again. So I'm kind of thinking of like my focus in research, both then and now, is just always on how emerging technologies are influencing creativity. And every new technology always influences creativity. So hopefully that gives me a bit of job security. But like, you know, the classic example is like painting completely changed when there was the invention of the paint tube, because suddenly you didn't need to be in your studio painting. You could go out into the world and paint. And so that was like a very simple technology that revolutionized painting. Of course, there's all the conversations about photography and how that's sort of an equivalent to the conversation of generative AI right now. And so I'm really curious about two things. One is future technologies that are going to influence creativity, of course, but how existing technologies are going to create new art forms. It's not generative art as a medium, which, as I mentioned, some people are already talking about, but what is the reaction to generative AI going to create as a new artistic movement? So example of like with photography, Impressionism came into being because people were saying we want to capture the human experience in a way that isn't just like the vertical like snap of a camera. And so they started, you know, making these more perceptual based canvases. And so I'm really curious, like, what is going to be the equivalent for generative AI? What is that reactionary art form that like can only be made now? It's probably some form of like you know, even more conceptual art and like performance art, like you said, the handmade. But I'm curious to see how that all converges and coalesces into a new art form.
It's going to be exciting. That's for sure.
Definitely.
I was thinking, I assume it's an impossible question, but thinking about, you know, the curation and algorithmic curation and stuff like that, do you think there will be some kind of demand or revival or something of like explicitly alternate curation algorithms? I
mean, I don't know if it'll be algorithms, but I think that there is this explicit craving for for curation that is not the way that these algorithmic platforms are currently curating, right? So often the question I get when I talk to, especially groups of students, they're like, where can I interact with creative content that isn't curated this way? Like, where can I get out of the like hyper-personalized feed that's like regurgitating the same stuff to me all the time? And there aren't like a great many answers. One example is the platform called Mubi. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's MUBI. it is basically an alternative to Netflix. So Netflix, obviously, completely algorithmically driven, just like huge amounts of content selected, quote unquote, for you. But Mubi is curated by a team of sort of like movie experts that they comb through a bunch of films and they choose like what they think are the best indie films and put them on their platform. So it's a smaller quantity, but supposedly higher quality. But that then returns us to the questions and the problems that we've had in generations past, where like it's just a few humans that are suddenly like imbued with all of this power.
Yeah, they're gatekeeping instead.
They're gatekeeping, exactly, and they tend to be people from the global north with like certain elite educational backgrounds and so forth. So the idea, which I still really resonate with, of like Instagram and these other platforms, was to democratize that access to creativity, that like you can access movies that are made, in the global south, for instance, that maybe these global curators wouldn't know about. So I appreciate that idea. The problem is just that there's so much content that like we need some way to curate it. So it's basically like either it's curated how these sort of quote unquote elite humans want it to be curated, or it's curated by these algorithmic platforms, and it's kind of like pick your poison. And so I would love to think through like what could a third option be. I did see a really interesting research paper recently come out of Michael Bernstein's lab at Stanford. Specifically looking at like a new form of curation that could be driven by the crowd or like the user base, but not be entirely algorithmic, but like have the crowd directing the algorithm. So I think there's some interesting things being explored, but nothing has really proliferated yet.
Yeah, I mean it's so easy again to be grumpy and say I would just like no curation at all. Let's give it me sort of, and then you're overwhelmed, or you only get the stuff that you picked yourself.
Exactly,
and that's certainly a creation, but there's a lot of searching to build that up, and it's not like.
And how do you discover? And even searching, if you search on Google, that's algorithmically curated, right? So it's like, how do you even search? Just go to the library, and get out the books.
This was super interesting.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Tack för att just du lyssnar på Kodsnack. Om du vill stödja oss, varför inte tipsa en bekant om podden? Eller lämna en recension i till exempel iTunes eller något annat ställe där det går att sätta betyg på poddar. Du kan också stödja oss genom att köpa oss en kopp kaffe på Coffee, ko-fi.com/kodsnack. Alla pengar går direkt till att göra podden bättre och trevligare. Du kan också komma och hänga i vår Slack-kanal. Länk finns på kodsnack.se, precis som alla andra länkar och all annan info kopplat till varje avsnitt. Sist men inte minst finns det också en länk till vår Spreadshop-butik där du kan köpa tröjor och andra prylar med Kodsnacktryck. Återigen, tusen tack för att du lyssnar. Vi hörs.
Let me put it this way, Mr. Raymer. The 9000 series is the most reliable computer ever made. No 9000 computer has ever made a mistake or distorted information. We are all, by any practical definition of the words, foolproof and incapable of error.